So welcome. I'm Kathy Aubert. I'm so excited you're here for Foundations of Diversity and Equity Trainings. I use she, her pronouns. And I just want to acknowledge the original caretakers of the land that I'm on right now, the Arapaho. And in my privileged identities, I forget to claim my pronouns or talk about original caretakers, indigenous folk. And having a slide in my workshops helps me to remember. Now, since December, I've made a commitment to do it every time I do a workshop, and sometimes even without the slide, I remember. But I also know me. I get so kind of wound up before workshops. I need things to prompt me. And so as we're here talking about foundational equity, inclusion trainings, my intent is to give you not only activities, but also some of the behind the scenes thinking I do, some design principles. Because the truth is, I used to believe, if you've known my work for the last 35 years, and some people tell me that they saw me in the late 80s, early 90s. What I believed was if I just did fun activities, and then I did train the trainers, and I believed if I just gave people really fun activities, then they could just go out and do it. And now I realize that activities are critical. Experiential learning, I believe, is how people learn and get transformed and get those skills translated to the workplace. But it's not sufficient. You need powerful training activities, but you have to, as a facilitator, really get clear and be, the term I learned from Elsie White Cross Associates was self as instrument, that you're a clear instrument for the work. You're not projecting or puking your stuff on other people. You have good knowledge of the content, good facilitation, design skills, but you also have to have deep self-work, really deep self-awareness of yourself so that you're not triggered, you're not reacting in ways that undermine learning. Now you can be triggered and engaged, but not in fact reacting in ways that undermines the learning. And so to be centered and grounded and navigate your own triggers, navigate when other people are triggers, these are all critical skills. And on pages 3 to 8 in the packet, I have a self-assessment that I use when I'm doing training of facilitators, training of trainers. I have people do it beforehand, afterwards, and that's what I design my Train the Trainer to develop those capacities. So I really hope you do that self-assessment to see where you are in your capacities and use that before you decide to use some of these activities. Because if you're ready, that's why I'm doing this workshop. If you're already facilitating, if you just need some more tools, if you've been out there doing this for a while and you're feeling a little flat and you just want some more ideas, or if you're in a Train the Trainer already and you want to expand. But I'm hoping that and counting on that you'll do your self-work, you'll develop your capacity as a facilitator and trainer to design, facilitate before you kind of find these fun, shiny toys and just go out and do them. And I speak from personal experience, and I probably did some harm when I first started because I hadn't done my self-work. So here's what we're about to do today. My hope is your outcome of this workshop is you get more and more ideas on how to create effective learning environments that really deepen learning, behavior change, not only in the moment, but transfers then to the work environment. And again, design, facilitating, engaging, powerful trainings that aren't just fun. In fact, I have fun as the aftermath, but it's really about deepening people's capacity to create greater inclusion, equity, social justice in the organization. Now, behavior change is what we're focused on. I think too many people want to change people's values, and I used to. And I don't believe that's our responsibility or even our right in an organization. Yeah, if you push me on it, if it's a train, I don't want to go there. I'll just stay here. But I think organizations have a critical responsibility and a moral responsibility to get very clear what are the behaviors we expect, train to those, and then hold people accountable for these required behaviors that they have. And these training activities, I think, will help you get some solid foundational. Now, I don't mean just 101. I'll bet this is 102, 103, but we start out gently, meet people where they are, and then by the end of the day, just really challenging people around privilege and marginalized, letting the activities challenge folks. Now, my hope is that in this workshop, you'll get not only activities, but again, design principles. And this is part 1 of my favorite activities. This is probably 12 to 16 hours of activities between part 1 and part 2. And then I'll throw in some facilitation tips. And if you've been to my webinars before, you know my flow. It's a good 60 minutes of my sharing ideas, tools, strategies. And then with these two, part 1 and 2, facilitating workshops. With the virtual institutes, that'll be June 21st, I'll actually facilitate those. So those are 3-hour live workshops. You can bring together 1 up to 6 or up to 50. There's different price points, but I'll lead these. Today, I'll just be highlighting, and you'll see the slides of some of the debriefs in the packet, or even more, and especially there's a whole lesson plan I developed 10 years ago, so please give me grace if the language isn't quite up to speed. But some of my favorite activities. So you'll have what you need. But I also think watching me facilitate in the live virtual institute might also be useful, especially if you're new to facilitation or you're doing a train the trainer. Could also be a great resource to have to add to your practice as you're preparing people. So one day, Alice came to a fork in the road. She saw a Cheshire cat in a tree and asked, "Which road do I take?" "Well, where do you want to go?" was the cat's response. "Well, I don't know," Alice answered. Then the cat said, "Then it doesn't matter." What I know is I was so activity driven when I started out doing workshops. Even before I went full-time consulting, I was in student affairs and residence life. And I was like, "Ooh, what are you doing?" "Oh, I'll do the same thing." Never had self-reflection if I was ready, capable, had the skills. Didn't ask if the group was ready, willing. I didn't do needs assessments. Maybe did a little bit as, you know, the next few years in. But again, it was the shiny toy. And so if I don't know where to go, then any activity will get me there and usually off the path I want to be. There are so many activities, and there's so many more than I'll talk about in these 2 sessions. Some that I do and some that my colleagues that I respect deeply do. But I wanted to share foundational workshop activities. I find when I come to campuses and other organizations, folks try to come in kind of farther along than the folks are. I went to this one campus, and they had, the first thing they did with the new student leaders, the resident assistants, was white privilege workshops. And it blew up because they hadn't met people where they are and done the foundational work. And so that's another reason I just want to share this so that more folks have the capacity. But you have to make sure you do it based on strategic plan, where the organization wants to be, where people are, what's the current state of the climate and the culture. All right. And one of the first questions you want to be asking, where do I begin? Where do you want to go? Is what's the current capacity? And this scale can be useful in a survey or just informally to have people reflect. You can bring your leaders together. If you have a diversity change team, you can bring facilitators together if they've been out doing other workshops. What do you think the capacity is? And I don't mean capable as in they can if they want to. I mean demonstrated capacity of leaders, managers, staff, to truly create and maintain inclusive programs and services for the clients. And too often organizations are externally focused, but they also need to look inside to create and reinforce inclusive, socially just workplace environments so people feel valued, treated with dignity, respect, really empowered to lead, create inclusion for those you serve. And so finding out where you are, that's the first step. What's the current skill, capacity, knowledge, skill? And using pages 11 to 16, I believe, or 15, that self-assessment for inclusion practitioners are some of the tools and skills that I want every manager, every leader, actually every employee to have. And so you might use that to look through and maybe develop a jot form or a survey monkey, have people take it. Now, again, they're self-reflecting, but you could ask them about their colleagues. You could say, how ready, how capable, demonstrated capacity of leaders. You can do a whole bunch of things, but somehow you have to figure out if it's general in the organization or if a department has said, we'd love some training, you have to go in and do some needs assessment. Where are they in this handout may be useful to you. These are the capacities that I will teach to in all the activities here in part 1 and part 2. Now, it's not enough to know their demonstrated capacity. By the way, as facilitators, you may want to take this and see what your demonstrated capacity is. There's an overlap between this and the design and facilitation one, but I think there's enough difference it can be useful to do both. Lately, I've also been asking, as people ask me to come into their organization, about what their desired capacity is. And so where do you want people to be? And of course, their first answer might be 10, but if the current capacity is 2 to 3, and we have a 7.5 or 7-hour workshop over an 8-hour day, I ask, well, what would realistically, could you imagine, what would be success look like if they could leave that workshop with more knowledge, skills, self-awareness, and capacity to apply in the workplace? What do you think would be reasonable after literally it's probably a 6-hour with breaks and lunch? And have that conversation. And then I like to have them think about readiness. And what I mean by readiness is, do the potential participants know why they're going to be there? Have they a clear understanding of the organizational commitment and vision about equity and inclusion, and their responsibility to not only participate in this session, but to take this learning back into the workplace and use it day to day? And has the path been clear? This is readiness, so that they can attend. And work isn't necessarily piling up, or when they come back, they're not expected to jump right in, but the supervisor's ready to meet with them and ask, what are you learning? What's been the impact? And let us know what you learned that you think we can implement. So that's some readiness. And then willingness, not only individually, organizationally, but that particular group of participants. What's the degree of resistance? And you can guess, maybe based on how much training they've had, where the organization is on that MCOD, multicultural organizational development model that I talked about in the two previous webinars about creating inclusive organizations. What's their openness to learn? How eager are they? Is it mandatory? Is it voluntold? Or is it really voluntary they get to come? And so understanding this can get you to understand where they are and help you choose among all these activities I'll share which ones you want to use, or how you want to use them to meet them if they're early awareness, middle, or pretty aware. I believe people have to have a very strong foundational base of key concepts, tools, and skills, like I'll be sharing, in order then to build on some of the other key competencies they'll need to do systemic institutional change. Having authentic dialogue in teams when you're really trying to change the culture and climate. But without this solid foundation and breadth of differences, any other intervention will probably fall flat. And so you may have seen this in an earlier webinar. But in part one, I'm going to share activities. These are my learning outcomes that I'll do. If somebody asks me to do a full day training, again, I may put different emphasis on different ones of these depending upon where they are, where they want to go, and their current capacity. But definitely have to understand the leadership case, some people call it the business case, for creating an inclusive, socially just organization. And not just be lectured to, but activities so they get it in their body. Really looking at the full breadth of differences. And if you've been on my webinars, you know I have those group identity cards. And I think there's at least 27 or 28 categories of difference where there's privileged and marginalized groups within that. And then there are blank cards in that. So there's many more differences where people get treated with undeserved privilege and clearly undeserved marginalization. Full breadth of difference. And my strategy of that is, the trap is too often, this is what I did. I went into work very early. In the early 80s, I was talking about sexism and homophobia and heterosexism and diversity, but I didn't have an understanding of the full breadth of differences, didn't have a passion for it. And I think the reason was I hadn't looked at my own privileged identities. And so having people in this workshop be able to have authentic dialogue about inclusion and exclusion, and that's not only based on differences, but it's based on privilege and marginalization, and having them get those skills and concepts and the capacity, increasing comfort and ease. And I don't mean, well, some of it's the white fragility and other male and heterosexual fragility, but part of it is the capacity to say race, to talk about whiteness, to talk about disability, to say, how are we treating folks who are marginalized by religion in this organization in full breadth, and how do classism dynamics play out? People need to be able to talk this freely. They're not yet ready if they're doing this workshop usually. And so we'll warm them up, but full breadth, authentic dialogue is critical. It's not about content only. It really is the capacity and the skill building of an authentic dialogue. Full breadth of differences, privileged and marginalized. As we move into, part two, we'll do some privilege today, but then we'll really start to look at how these play out in microaggressions, have people look at their own privileged and marginalized identities. We'll do that this time. And then usually even in a one day, I'll just do a teaser and I'll use the group identity cards to begin to look at policies, programs, and services. I like people to have all three levels, individual, group, and organization, even in a foundation. And I just it's almost like a commercial of what part two, not my part two, but their next steps could look like. And then something around next steps, leadership, that can be doing organization. And again, if you're working with all levels of the organization, you can put people into mixed groups and have them say what we want leaders doing differently. We'll put them into their work teams, what we could be doing differently, and then some individual next steps, action planning. It all depends on the context, how much time you have, who's in the room, what's been done before, has there been a critical incident, what's happening nationally, and you have to think about all that. But my point today is just to share a bunch of activities, and then you can be thinking in those complex terms on your own. The end goal is to get people skilled up to infuse equity inclusion into everything they do. And after a foundation day, they may not have all they need, but the willingness will be higher, the readiness will be higher, and the common terms and knowledge of these key concepts will be there so that supervisors can have those conversations on teams, and then people can move into being inclusion practitioner training, or maybe they want to move into train the trainer. But the key is you can't talk about inclusion without acknowledging exclusion. I've heard the Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington talking about that recently. Too many organizations want to say, yes, we value diversity, let's talk about inclusion. These workshops are designed to give people the capacity to speak their truth and hear the truth about issues of exclusion, and it's just critical. And then some skills to intervene and shift them. My activity is designed to meet people where they are, anticipate resistance, and help them move through the resistance without it having to come out. That's my strategy. It might come from growing up in a family that was very conflict averse, or it wasn't safe to be in conflict with people in power. And I also found this type of workshop can be very important to help people accelerate lots of people moving more quickly to be able to be change agents. Now, I find it very useful to think about designing workshops in 3 acts. And if you've done a lot of workshops, you might be analyzing this whole webinar, how I'm doing this. But as I'm doing a training, I'm thinking about Act 1, creating a container. And this one is often one that's skipped over. I know I used to move too quickly just to get to the content. Let's get to what we have to do. Doesn't it sound like white culture to you? Just urgency, we got to get through it. As opposed to what I've learned is we have to create a container for learning so that people can truly begin to let down all the fear and let down the guard and slowly begin to trust themselves and others so that we really maximize learning and learning transfer into the work environment. You have to prepare the ground for the learning. It's almost like it's gardening. At least that's what we're doing here in Denver. So you have to prepare the soil, plant the seeds, and then things sometimes might grow slowly. Then you have part 2. Act 2 would be the body of the workshop, and that's where all the content is. So after you do the learning outcomes and all those things and creating the container, you can then move into teaching about the content you want to do, and then finally applying it to the workplace, and then closure. Creating a container, you're trying to maximize the learning transfer. So for me, these process goals are as important as your content goals that I just went over. You're trying to create a learning community, compassionate support, passionate dialogue, coaching, feedback, and that metaphor of each one teach one. So I'm trying to get many people put me on a pedestal, especially as I get older. I'm Dr. Aubert, and I'm trying to get it so that we're each teaching one. And yes, I'm running the activities. I, as you can tell, have a lot I like to say, especially as we're debriefing activities. But I want them to build enough connections with each other and themselves so that they learn from each other. And to be honest, they will remember and learn more if a colleague or a peer says it than if I say it, or if you say it as a facilitator. And so at least all these activities are setting it up, this container, so that peers can teach peers, and the voices that are about equity inclusion can get heard more. And it's about bravery to speak up, meaningful engagement. It's really about that trust and belonging we're trying to build in this container. Now, there are so many tools. And again, starting on page 16, there's that detailed lesson plan I mentioned earlier. I think it's called 101 or 101 training guide. Those are literally word for word. You can learn it by reading it and then get up and lead them. And not every activity is in that because I've added some new ones, but that's a lot that I would recommend. And what I want to do now is just share with you what I would do in a pretty much, this will probably be the first 5 or so hours of contact. So I think it's critical when I come to a workshop, I'm there at least a half hour early, of course, making sure all the AV works. But then I'm going around shaking hands, chatting with folk. And I particularly might go up to people who are not engaging others. Or if a table looks pretty homogeneous, I'll make sure I go up to that, particularly if they present in one or more privileged identities. And I'm just trying to take the temperature of the room and build relationships and have people see my personality. I also get energy by working with people. I'm kind of an ambivert, Most people think I'm an extrovert, but I do need tons of time to recover. But I do like to engage folks and get some energy and a feel for the room. And then if you can, get the senior leader to frame why this is important, the business case, the leadership case, tie it to the strategic plan, if there's a mission or an equity inclusion, a statement. Again, no more than like 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes they do 10 and just sucks the air out of the room that I've already developed by wandering around. But you know, you can get over that. But I like it 3, 4 minutes at the most, but enough so they own the authority and they're the ones that are then bringing me in. Somebody introduced me maybe, but I hate those long introductions, especially when they start credentialing. Now, some groups, I might do that. If there are a lot of faculty, I'm generalizing, but often as a student affairs person in higher ed, I'm already coming in as marginalized. So depending on the group, if it's executive leaders, they don't know me, I might credential a little bit. But you know, again, I have all this privilege. If you're a person of color or other marginalized identities, credentialing might be important if people already wonder if what you're doing and come from a deficit model. But I like to come in and just tell a story. Personal story that relates to the topic, that usually shows what I used to be like, as in not very aware, what happened that meant me get more aware, and hopefully what I'm moving towards getting even more effective. Something related to the topic. And so what I'll do is often maybe tell a story as a white person about how I used to work in higher ed and doing diversity workshops like this, but I didn't realize that I was only talking about being a woman and lesbian and kind of diversity. I mentioned race, but I had no consciousness of what it meant to be a white facilitator or a white person in the organization. So, and I'll maybe stay another minute, but something where I really try to set the stage of authentic engagement, honest about where you used to be, where you are now. And I think that helps. So then I have people kind of go greet. And this was another Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington. I never realized that if people can just move around, and that could be if they're already using a chair or they get up and they walk around, just go greet 5 people. It just gets the energy blossoming really quickly. And I say 5 or 6 people, 2 minutes, just go say hello, especially people you don't know well. When you hear the chime, I always use a ding. I call her Tinkerbell. And then I ask them to find a high five buddy, because people usually sit either in rows or if you're at tables with people they know, and often people they're working with. And I'm trying to mix that up. And so you then find a high five buddy. Now this is I first learned this from people that were at Leadership. I'm sure it's a pretty common, but it's somebody you can get people to do a high five. I'm a germaphobe, so I have people do a high elbow if they want, or an air five. Again, it's just a light way. People come in anxious, concerned. If they've been to other diversity workshops that did not go as well from their perspective, they think it's going to be another one that they're going to be leaving feeling less than and scolded and those sorts of things. And that's not my strategy. People don't learn if they're feeling guilty or, quote, if they feel attacked, whatever that means. So find their high five buddy, and I give them 20 seconds or so just to say, hi, who are you? I've learned that to not move too quickly. Some people would say you give them a minute or 2, but I don't. But anyway. So here are the first things. And I usually break this up in a couple. I ask them to note their gender pronouns if they're willing or want to. I usually have them put them on their name tags. And then what's up? Again, another Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington. And I'll model that about what's going well in your life, anything that's weighing on your heart. And I might say it's hard to be an adult in adult learning, and that could be if they're 18 or whatever. There's a lot going on in our lives. And so, oh, by the way, most of my workshops are college students, traditional age or older, and mostly, I would think 20s, 30s, up to 70s. So take all this with a grain of salt. If you are working with K-12, even preschool, these may or may not work, but surely the teachers, these will work great with. And then we share some of that out, just really reinforcing to be present here. And then I ask, so every meeting you start, do you do some type of icebreaker or a one-on-one where you get to connect human to human with someone before you get into the task? And most people say no. And I say, notice how you're feeling right now. How much more aware and creative are you in a meeting if you could feel like this before you start it? And so what I'm trying to show early is everything that I do in my workshops, I try to say, how can you take this back to your team and your organization? I don't always do the last bullet here, but if I have folks that are new to equity inclusion or I know there's resistance, I might ask them to say, so what's your role? How is what you do, accounting, custodial, sales, whatever it might be, related to creating an inclusive work environment and supporting this breadth of the folks we serve? And I'll maybe even do something like this. I'll say, so you might serve people who work directly with customers. So just kind of keep going back, and how do you support these folks that then work with increasingly diverse customer base? Or maybe you work with people to help the team be effective. So what is your role in creating inclusive environments or creating inclusive services? And then I'll hear several of those out, especially again, if folks are new to it, or if I have people at, quote, the low levels of the organization. And if they hear each other say that, they might get an idea, A, why it's important they do it, but B, oh, I have a role to do, because again, that's the end goal. So after you debrief that, I might have them stay with their high five buddy, because again, I like high five buddies to have several conversations. So they have a little deeper connection. And in a full day, I might use the high five buddies in the afternoon again, depending on the energy of the room. And this is one of my favorite ones, and you've probably seen me do this, but what is the source of your passion and commitment? Create inclusive organizations that accelerate. I no longer am okay with support, promote. I need acceleration. I'm 61, and we got to be moving faster than we are. People are dying, literally and spiritually. So the persistent success of all the employees, and then to create policies, programs that really serve the full breadth. And I might use, by the way, every time you ask people to do something, I would tell a quick story, not a 5-minute one generally, but a quick one. And so I would usually talk about how I, as I've said already, I started this work out of my marginalized identities. Now notice I'm starting to use that language. I believe in these first hours, so I start through storytelling and them telling stories to get the concepts in the room before we then build on what the real definitions are. And so I'll say I entered this work out of pain. And as a woman, as a lesbian, and as someone with 70 more pounds on my body, high school and college and grad school, I really wanted the world different. And so I would do these workshops, talk about diversity, but I wanted the world to be different so I could fit in. And it wasn't until I was full-time consulting that folks, LC White Cross, especially firms, members, confronted me around my incompetence and inability as a white person to dismantle racism, much less my other privileged identities. And so it's really now, that's where I get the source of my passion, is supporting people to recognize their privileged identities, kind of move with the resistance, because I know that resistance, and see what they can do to partner with folks in marginalized identities, follow the leadership of people in marginalized identities, collectively, collaboratively, to create inclusion and to do our part. So I'll say something like that. You might have your own. What I also do is I'll give them a few other ideas of what they can talk about. I might say, you may want to talk about, maybe it's a customer that really got your attention, or someone in your family or friend, or something from your own life. Just why are you passionate in this organization, helping this organization create greater inclusion inside and outside? Leave them alone for a couple minutes, give them a halfway point on this one for sure, and then hear some of those out. And be sure to have walk-in mics. Even if you have 20 people, I would still have a microphone. I'm finding more and more folks have dynamics with hearing for all kinds of reasons, or understanding English for all kinds of reasons. And so I've been using a mic more and more out of my privileged identities. So you hear the passion, and it's in them. It's their passion. You've already heard the leaders say why it's important, and now they're finding up their own reason. And again, I read the room, and if they're ready to go and 3 or 4 people is enough for passion, then I'll ask them to notice their bodies. And what was it like to share? And they're like, I'm energized. I feel connected. I feel like we're aligned. And I'm like, can you talk about your passions as a team, as a division? And do it about once a month, at least once a quarter, because this work is hard and it's long-term. Culture change can take 7, 10, 12 years. We have to keep the energy up. So notice again, I'm having them apply it to the work environment. Sometimes I ask this, particularly if we're around leaders, all diversity councils, or if they're inclusion practitioners, train the trainers. How do you feel knowing that others are looking to you to create greater equity, inclusion, social justice in everything you do? And so I'll have them talk about that and then hear that out. And this can bring up the fear and maybe even some of the resistance, like it's not really my job, or I have too much to do. And so any of that can come up. And so I like to engage resistance before it comes up or comes sideways in a workshop. You can tell my pattern. I like, and this I might turn into have them in groups of 4. Passion was in 2s. I might have them find another high five buddy and do that in 4 if I was doing that. At some point, I like them to think about every expert in everything was once a beginner. And especially if you have a lot of privileged identities, to just try to close that gap And also maybe another quick story about what you're learning and where you feel less competent, and that we're all here teaching each other. But as a metaphor, just to remind them of Helen Hayes's comment here. If they're already in another pair of high five buddies, and if not, you move them into one. And then at this time, see, they're in groups of 4. I'd keep them in this one if you do this. What do you see occurring nationally, locally, internationally? It has this session important. Now, I don't always do this, but again, if you think there's resistance and there's going to be a lot of pushback, then I might not do it. But also because they're in groups of 4 and they might hear their colleagues, that might help reduce some of the folks that are like, why do we have to be here? And definitely I would do this if there's been a recent local or national critical incident that has been publicized, and or it's a team that really needs to get honest about change. So if it's a leadership team that you're doing it, if it's a diversity change team that you're doing the foundational work, they have to really be able to talk about how the context is impacting them. And to be honest, I do this if I feel like it. I like to do it, but again, you're getting the flavor that there's a lot of stuff, and you can probably do 3 to 4 of these before it feels old to folk, in my opinion. And then you can ask them what their hopes are. I do that usually if I'm doing a 2-day, maybe retreat, but sometimes you can ask that as well. Grounded in the organization's mission. Now, if the leader's done that already, you can just reference it and say, and put it back up again as a visual, or if it's in the handouts, or if the leader did enough. But if they haven't, grounded in the mission. Sometimes I have it read aloud, have them turn to a partner, what stood out. As you review this, what does it mean to you? I'll ask, show me hands. Who's ever seen this before? And there's usually just a handful of people. So I like them to know why we're doing it. It's all about the leadership case that we do several times. And then I just might say, this is what your organization says you're going to be and you are expected to do. And this workshop is to help you get the skills so that you can be successful here. Notice I'm showing them their self-interest to pay attention. I like organizations to be ready to say, here's the competencies we want you to have. We'll train you. And in 12 months, if you've not demonstrated those to at least a moderate capacity, we'll be having a conversation in performance management about how to get you there. And if in another 3 or 4 months you've not made significant progress, we'll be having a different conversation. That's what I would like. Because if you have a leader that can't do budgets, that can't do supervision effectively, can't do strategic planning, you would be having that conversation with them if you're an effective organization. Why isn't equity inclusion handled the same way? So they've talked about passion. It's grounded in the mission. That raises the bar of what the expectation is for them in the session as well as going back. Now, when I'm doing trainings, I organize my thinking on how to teach self-awareness and skill building at these 3 levels. And you may have seen these before. Some people call it IGO for individual, group, and organization. And I use the metaphor of trifocals because I literally have them. And it's a metaphor that at any moment I need to be able to recognize people as individuals with a life experience. They may have similar group identities to me, but they have different life experiences, deserving respect and dignity. And then everybody has group memberships, multiple privileged and marginalized. And as a group level, we need to train people how to recognize breadth of group memberships, privilege, marginalization, and all the microaggressions, the common examples in treatment. And then how have to realize that given your identities, people will engage you differently, and you engage people differently based on which identities you notice or care about or have bias towards. So that's all the group level. And you'll notice this part 1 and part 2 mostly are at the group level, recognizing individuals, but it's really at the group level. And then also holding the full context of the organization, the culture, and the climate. So I like to introduce this concept early. And so these next quick activities, and you might be familiar with some of these. Again, most of these activities I've gathered over 35 years from other folks. Some might have been guided to me, quote original. But early getting them, again, it could be if they're in those groups of 4, they're with their high five buddy, but you get them a new partner. So they've been with their high five buddies, and now they get with somebody that was the other high five buddy. A time you felt you mattered. You were part of a group where you felt included. And I'll talk about Girl Scout camp or something where I could just be myself, exhale. Couple minutes, give them a halfway, hear some of that out. And I'll usually ask, how did you feel when you mattered? To hear that out. And then I'll say, so when you're in a work environment, you feel respected, valued, connected. how does that impact you in the workplace? And they'll talk about productivity, creativity. So we're building the business case from their stories. Plus they're doing storytelling and you're building connections. All that's needed as we get to the more challenging parts of the workshop. Have them switch partners again. There's still one person they haven't talked to. And this is the other side of the coin. And I spend a little more time on this one. The time you felt treated less than, excluded, disrespected because of a group identity. We're trying to get everybody from individual to group identity. That's a whole part of this workshop, point of this workshop. So tell a story. I'll talk about having 70 more pounds on my body and being called Kathy Obese instead of Kathy Obear by my friends. What happened? How did you feel? Did anybody speak up? I give them a good minute and a half, 2 minutes. Now, some people can slow this down if you really are more of if you have a strong introverted group or you just are like, I want them to be in dialogue, you can slow it down. I like to keep stuff going because many folks, at least places I get asked to work, there's moderate to high resistance. And so I like to keep it going and just let the defrosting happen through the activities and the relationship building and the community building. So again, you debrief this a similar way. After you give them a halfway point, how'd you feel? What are all the feelings and how effective can you be? How often does this happen? How do people, 0 to 100% of the time, do people feel this way? And I usually collect up some of that. And then I would move on to this activity, which is imagine you had a magic wand and you could, oh, by the way, I collect up stories before I move on. So it's not just the feelings. You really want 4 to 6 stories, and I ask for short versions. And after each one, I'm like, who relates? I like to do a single clap. Everyone gets acknowledged for participating. I'm listening. If they enter and they're all doing around sexism, then I'll hear 2. Then I'll say, what did you notice about those stories? They're both on sexism, all right? What's a story about another difference? And so I'm teaching them how to pay attention now at the group level content, and also doing breadth of differences. And, 4 to 6 to try to get 3 identities. Sometimes you're lucky, you'll get 4. But those stories can begin to get people to go, oh, this stuff really happens, and it happens to people I care about or I work with. And as I'm doing it, all these activities, I'm dropping in terms like, oh, I really hear the prejudice, the bias that fueled that. Or, so nobody spoke up, so they were bystanders just sitting there watching. Or, how do y'all feel hearing all these microaggressions? So I don't necessarily have to teach the terms, but in my stories and in others, I really hear the impact. And, regardless of their intent, the impact was still there. So I hope you can see how we're just scaffolding and moving people along. Now I'll say, if you had a magic wand, just imagine what kind of an organization would you create? And I have them answer these 2 questions. What should no one ever have to experience or feel in the organization? At this point, I'm doing a large group brainstorming, and I'm looking towards areas of the room of people that I haven't heard from. And I don't stare at people, and I don't call them in to talk usually. But I do scan the entire, and I'm looking for especially energy that has felt a little stuck. But we've moved the energy a lot so far. So by now, I usually get new voices in the room. I get 10 or 12, and I usually repeat each one just so people can hear. And then how often do our employees feel this way, our colleagues? And then the second question, what do you believe everyone deserves to feel and experience? So the first is no one should ever have to, and then everyone deserves, and then how often? Now, sometimes folks want a definition about equity, inclusion, and social justice, but I'll say to people, I'll give you one in a bit, but all you have to do is ask these 2 questions in your unit and have engaged dialogue or have it with some of your team. And that is the environment you're wanting to create, what no one deserves and what everyone deserves. You're pretty close to what equity inclusion could be. At this point, again on time, you may want to pop them back to their high five buddy, but I really like them to do this question because this gets them to privilege. The other ones, they're in marginalized identities mostly, and this is a time you used to have bias and privilege towards a group, discomfort. Something happened and you shifted. And I'll tell 2 stories usually because this is a pretty high risk. And I'm back with their high five buddies so that they might feel more comfort. And I'll talk about my mom with brain cancer and how she was treated as someone with a disability. And then I'll talk about my own ignorance and discomfort around folks who identified as trans or gender nonconforming. And I'll tell a couple quick stories so they see the breadth. And then I'll tell them, you're just going to tell a quick story. And all I'm going to ask you is share what helped you shift so they know they don't have to tell the story. Shift happened. So at this point, you're hearing out what helped them shift. And then you say, so we all shifted. That means in this organization, with training and conversation, we can help people shift, and the people we work with, our customers, might also shift. Now, you may like another activity. Bingo on page 43, you can do the same different conversations, put one in each box. I like to do 6 boxes. This gets people moving around, a lot more energy. You have less, quote, control or understanding of what they're talking about, but if you have hundreds of people, sometimes I do a bingo, and there are a couple versions there that you can look at. Sometimes I do concentric circles if there's 20, 30 people. Sometimes 40 can be a seated concentric circle. If you do, 2 or 3, you can probably do a standing if you get really good data, if folks have any physical dynamics that would impact their mobility. But I generally will get a seated concentric circle, and then you just, after every talk, you say, okay, people on the outside circle, move one to the right, and the next one, people in the inside circle, move one to your left, and you can move them. So there's different ways that you can mix up the learning activities. I tend to do dyads and high fives because I like to get a lot in a workshop. And people are often in tables. I seem to have, 50, 80 to 100 in a room. And so I don't have the space often to do concentric circles. So at this point, you can do learning guidelines. Now, some people do it earlier on page 41, are the ones I use. I like people to get a feel for how the workshop's going to be so that they're really getting honest about what they want. And I actually do 2 quick things with them. I have them first use it applied to the work environment and ask which ones of these has your area explicitly negotiated and agreed to use in meetings, and they engage each other. And so, they reflect on the handout at the top. I usually just use the top 14. And then I have them turn to a pair or something, or if they're at tables, I might let them talk. But usually I'll do a clap once if you've done this in the last 6 months, and then nobody claps. I'm like, all right, in the last year, you've had this explicitly discussed, 1 or 2. I say, what could be different if everyone agreed to these sorts of things? Not rules, but you engage these ways. And then people will share. And then I'll have them share which ones would you love to have operating in your work environment. And I might do a quick dyad if energetically it's a more reflective group. And then I'll just do some large group because we're trying to set the container for the whole organization in each of these seminars. We're trying to change the culture. So you're changing it in these groups to then go out and back in their own organizations. Now, I then will have them apply. So which would you like in this workshop? And turn to somebody, which 5 or 10 would you like to have that give you enough challenge or support for learning, authentic dialogue, lean into your growth areas, learning edges. I also have a different version I sometimes use, which ones are easy for you that you will do in this group, which are a stretch, especially if it's a work group or a retreat or something that they're going to keep working together. But you can decide, but learning the guidelines and then applying them in a couple ways, and then how we're going to do it here. And don't leave guidelines until you say, so what do you do if you feel triggered here? Now, I always want to make sure they're talking about triggers. That's jargon language. I use hot button. What can they do? And that could be breathe. And I have people brainstorm. Breathe. They can doodle where they are. They can take a break. They can tell the whole group, something just happened. Can we slow down? They can tell me at a break. And so let them know that if they have that unexpected wave of emotion, they don't have to sit there, but they can move and let people know, or write a note to themselves, what's going on in me. So at this point, we just created the container for learning. And this may take an hour and a half if I have a full day. But you also notice we're teaching a lot of concepts and skills. They're getting to know each other, and we're building for the next more content that we'll be doing. So this is Act 1, containers. I just want you to take a deep breath and just reflect on this slide for a quick moment. And wow, how did I do all this? And again, if you're looking at this as a recording, you may just want to pause and reflect by yourself, or if you're watching with people, how did I welcome, get introduced, give the purpose, the outcomes, talk about the flow in this webinar, much less in a one day. I didn't do housekeeping on the webinar, but I usually do in a workshop. And then some warm-up icebreakers. I tend to do several because, again, I'm trying to build the community. I don't have people introduce themselves. I never remember. So I use the different warm-up activities for them to really get more intimate conversations with everyone. You can decide how you want to do that. So Act 2, that's where you get to teach skills, concepts, tools. You organize by building blocks, really scaffolding, sequencing. So you could just reflect back on what we've done so far and how I really was sequencing and scaffolding while infusing the language. And then every activity, especially I've been doing, but moving forward, there are a couple ways to think about debriefing. I love this one. What, so what, and now what? Now, you can use this for every activity, and you can also do it for the whole workshop. What are we here talking about? So what? What does this mean? Why does this matter? And then now what? And that would be the third act, which is application to the workplace, conclusion, action planning. And so these are just some of the questions that, and you've seen them already, and you'll see them in my slides. Adult learning theory is similar, but I can never remember it. Do, reflect, generalize, that's kind of the so what, and then apply. So, but I want to encourage you as facilitators, it's not just what comes to you, unless you're really intuitive, but to have a conceptual way to think about how do you debrief activities. Now, most times in workshops, I'll do some type of defining terms. That's what people want. And I don't spend a lot of time on this. I don't have anything in my handouts. I probably should. You know, diversity, some people use the metaphor of it's who's allowed in the party. It's who you invite to the party. And most organizations are increasing the diversity demographically. It's the demographics. We also want to maybe chat about what does equity, inclusion, social justice mean. And I like to do it with stories and memes. So you've probably heard the shoe analogy where equal is everybody gets shoes. Equity is everybody gets shoes that fit. People love that one, by the way. I add to it, shoes that fit, that match your style. Because if you gave me pink high heels, there was no way right? So equity is not just shoes that fit. There has to be some meet your needs, support your success. Another way to do equal equity, you've seen these memes, I'm sure, on Pinterest or Facebook. Equality is everybody gets equal things. Everybody gets the same box. Well, not everybody needs it. So equity would be you find out what people need for success and you provide that. Now, some people said, you know, we didn't see ourselves in that. And so they kept some of the images and then they added other images and got creative. But there's still the wall, right? And someone said, this is still just equity. We need liberation or social justice. Some people use inclusion, liberation, social justice. Similarly, I kind of do, but not everybody does. And so they're like, liberation is you actually remove the wall, policies, programs, systems so people can participate. But I'm like, they're not participating. Now they are. They're over there, but they're not in the game. And so I like to talk about social justice. Inclusive organization is people are in the game and they have the capacity to do it. And we change the rules and the barriers we get rid of so everybody can hang out and do that. I'll often, especially if I'm working in higher ed, but actually I've done this in other organizations. I love this Adams Bell Griffin definition. You may find your own. Social justice, a process and a goal. Full equal participation of all groups, mutually shaped to meet their needs. Includes a vision of society as equitable, all members physically, psychologically safe. So I have people read in the room. I also have it in the handouts, and then turn to a partner. What words stood out to you and why, and then hear that out. And usually the ones that are highlighted, because I love to highlight, but other things will come out. And then I'll ask, you know, how close are you to this? And then just to kind of get a feel. Now, the trap is wordsmithing. That's one reason why I don't spend a lot of time on definitions, because folks in resistance will say, well, what do you mean by race? And what's racism? And there's reverse racism. And in a foundations, I don't engage or do. And so I've never gotten that. But I just want to warn you of the trap that if definitions are really important and you want to spend time on them, there will probably be resistance that comes up. I'd rather do that as you're moving into the next level. And to be honest, you could have a diversity council come up with definitions. I think what I offer is way more than enough for folks to apply to their work, but you get to choose. Occasionally, if there's leaders that are resistant or people resistant, I'll have them say, what do you already do to create equity inclusion? So you're embracing strengths. It's not a deficit model, like you don't do it very well, and they get to share. Plus, if they learn from each other, or I'm getting resistance or challenge in my authority and I want them teaching each other, I might do that. Early on, I like to use a Malcolm X. You can't teach what you don't know. You can't lead where you won't go. And so I like to have people realize this is an experiential workshop. Sometimes I'll do that a half an hour ago. Sometimes I'll do it here. And I love getting Malcolm X in the room. So what we've been doing is the business case, the leadership case, the why, a lot of dyads, passion, mattering, marginalization, and then we're still working on the leadership case. And so again, I don't do this every time, but I want to at least highlight that you could do this, changes ahead. And the intent of this, and this is on page 45, and there's some other variations on page 48, to get people using stats so that because some people learn with statistics. So far, people might have really opened their heart through storytelling. Some people want to use stats. And so the ones on 45, I do a lot of work in higher ed. And so those are traditional age college students changing stats, as well as the patterns of dynamics of marginalization and microaggressions on campus. It's only 2 pages. It needs to be much broader. There's maybe 10 identities there. They're several years old, but I just used them last week and folks were loving them and they got great conversation out of them. Page 48 is something I co-developed in 2005 for financial institutions. So if you're in a nonprofit or if you're in a for-profit organization, that one might also get your attention. But you have to find the leadership case, the business case for why we're doing it. It gets more energy, and some people are still kind of holding back. But if they say it's about our financial future, it's about really serving folk, it might help a few more people come to the party. I have people in pairs or at a table half read the odd ones, half read the even, what's significant, and any other data they have. And so I want to make sure you invite them to bring in others because this is very limited. And then at a table or in groups of 2s, or you might want to move it to 4s, what seems significant, what got your attention, and this last bullet, compelling reason to accelerate change, what could be significant for us. So that's the meaning making, the so what, and it's moving into almost the now what, but compelling reasoning is a term I'm liking to use more. And by now you're probably at a break or a little bit before. But what you're doing is you're meeting people at the individual level, challenging them to group, and you just did a little bit of organizational level with the stats, but we're going to be going back to group. Now, this activity you've probably seen. I first saw it, came out of Leadership is where I was heard, but I also heard the Sustained Dialogue did it. It's one of my favorite. If I don't have a full 7.5 hours, and I only have like 5 or 6, I'll do less warm up and move to this more quickly. But I'll teach individual group to the organization of the group and say, we're going to be working all 3, and then this activity gets them there. So you start at the individual level. I don't know what it's called, but I call it Who Are You? You get people in pairs, a new pair, choose a fruit, one's blueberry, one's strawberry, who are you? And you have them just ask, who are you, 10, 12 times, and the person responds, I am. Make sure you model it. So I'll say, I'm someone that loves to be in the mountains. I love to sit outside reading historical fiction. I have 2 kitty cats. So they're at passion, leisure, interests. I'm like, when I'm around people, I'm more engaging, but boy, I need to have several hours of quiet time at night or be kind of watching a movie to just re-energize. So do a little bit of modeling and then you put them in a pair. Strawberry, you ask blueberry first, you give them some time. Switch, they ask the other way, you can debrief it. What was that like? Impact reactions. Then you say, now we're moving to the group level. Now I'm moving very fast, but I would slow it down a little bit. You know, we all are individuals, but we've got many group identities. Now, if you have group identity cards, I'd pull them out and have them flip through those or literally just spread them all out face up on the table so that they can just pick what they want to talk about. If you don't have those, I put up a slide like this so that this has maybe 20 different identities. And so I'll model and I'll have the group say in unison, you know, who are you? And I say, I'm somebody in a 31-year relationship that just was able to get married in 2005. Who are you? I don't have veteran status. Who are you? I grew up in a Protestant household. Who are you? I grew up in a heterosexual family, mother, father with 4 kids. So I'll just model, and I'm modeling ones that haven't yet got in the room. But if you don't do that, that's all right too. You're just modeling and then you put them into groups. Now I leave them there a little longer than 45 seconds. I also say, if people stop after 4 who are yous and they don't want to tell you any more of the group identities, leave them alone because they don't know you. Usually gets a laugh. And then I'll debrief that. I'll have them do it. And what was this like? And they'll say, it was actually kind of vulnerable and I wanted to say more, ask questions, or I didn't want to, you know. And so I'm like, how much do you know this person? Well, I know more than I used to. If you have time, I then like to have them move into some storytelling. And to be honest, when I skip this, the group isn't as formed. This activity really does help create greater trust and openness. I don't know how, because it's only a few minutes, but it's what's your story. And what I have each person do is reflect 4 to 6 group identities that seem to have impacted shaping them growing up. And when I model it, I'll do at least maybe 4 privileged identities. I'll talk about white, able-bodied, grew up in a education, valued, and master's, and mom had college, my dad had a master's. I'll talk about being athletic probably. and then a couple marginalized, female and lesbian, or maybe more weight on my body if I haven't told that story. Give people a few minutes to reflect, and then they're back with that same person, strawberry, blueberry, telling a story. And, it's like 3 or 4 minutes. If I have it, I'll give them 5. Give them a halfway point, and just the energy shifts when people can tell stories and debrief it. And they'll say, I feel more connected. They're my best friend now. Now, not everybody. You only hear from 2 or 3, 4 people. But the folks that are not quite yet bought in, the whole group feels like it's bought in. And so it just invites them in. And then I ask, how would your team be different if you felt this way about everybody? If you had these relationships where you could talk honestly? And I'm not saying all your old secrets, but enough so you know your group memberships, you can talk freely. And then if there's time, I'll move to the organizational level, but there's often not. And I have people talk about a policy, program, or service that did not meet their needs, created a barrier, negatively impacted them and or members of their marginalized group. So I'll talk about how in 9th grade, my folks sent me to an all-white private school. You had to wear dresses and skirts. And in Maryland, August, September, it was not my style, but I did it. But by October, I was cold. So I don't remember how. I don't know if it was just a petition or a sit-in or something, but I got that changed by the end of the year. And so just some stories about, and they don't have to have it change, but current anytime in your life, but they're getting the organizational level in individual, group, and organizations. I might do that in groups of 4 because not everybody thinks of one. So take you and your pair and get to another one, and a couple people tell stories. And so take a deep breath. So far we've been building a learning community, the container. They've got breadth of differences, leadership case, terms, common knowledge, IGO, individual, group, organization. Now it's time to build on that and go a little deeper and looking at microaggressions. It may be that I don't get to Q&A because I have another few pages I wanted to do on this. And so what I might do is stay on and answer some if people can stay, and or I'll clearly do them in the Q&A on June 19th, I believe. So I might ask people 0 to 10, how inclusive, socially just is your organization? If you have the time and people are mobile, I might have them literally move. But this is a little medium to high. But if it's leaders, I might do that. Do they all feel included, respected? And how would you know? Now, in a day, I don't always teach panning. This is on page 52. I got this from LCY Cross Tracking. Pay attention now. I don't always teach it. But if this is a skill building so again, if they came in with more awareness and it's more of a skill building foundation, then I might do that. And you teach people to describe the behaviors they see, the practices, but just the facts without judgment. So instead of saying people in this meeting are dismissive and disrespectful, they can learn to say, in this meeting, I've noticed I've been interrupted twice and someone else was just interrupted. And we both happen to be female, and I don't remember a man being interrupted yet. So you just name it at the group level. Now that's a pretty advanced intervention. So in a foundation workshop, I don't expect people to learn this, but we are going to teach them to be panning the environment, to look for microaggressions, and to move towards being able to describe just the facts as we move into engaging in part 2. So I want to introduce panning early. So they just start using the language or know that judgments, interpretations, or assumptions, we want to check them or at least interrupt them. My challenge here is that we need to scan the environments and our own knowledge so that all of these are on our screen, and most people might only have 1 or 2 they're passionate or know about, but to be change agents and people in this organizations, we need to create an environment that has everybody feeling valued, respected, full breadth of differences. So as facilitators, and you can teach this as well, you're panning the content of what's discussed in meetings, but also if you notice people are not all in, you want in the group dynamics, you invite in other people, you invite in other topics, but also you're panning group dynamics to interrupt and name unproductive behavior, unproductive team dynamics that impact us or our customers. You can teach panning at all 3 levels. And so you're panning yourself, your feelings, your reactions. A couple times earlier I said, take a deep breath. What are your feelings? You talked about passion. That was panning themselves. This workshop's really about demographics, dynamics, and panning if things are similar or different. So the whole microaggression is really at the group level, but people have to get to the group level before they'll acknowledge that there's a pattern. It's not just because that person at the individual level got treated that way. And then you can pan policies and practices. So on page 53 is a skill. It's a list of some of the things I think about when I'm in a workshop, when I'm in a meeting, and again, depending when you want to teach skills, this has been a lot of awareness and connecting, so I think at this point people might like a skill. Everything's been a skill, they just don't know it yet necessarily. So I have them check off which of these do you pay attention to unconsciously. You're noticing who interrupts, who gets interrupted, who's looking at who, what topics get talked about, which ones don't. And just have them check it off, turn to a partner, and which ones do you want to add to your toolkit. So take a deep breath. We've been focusing on all these key competencies. These are competencies everyone needs in the business. And if you're working with youth, whether they're younger or college age or older adults in college, these are the life skills they need to be effective in careers. And so ones I haven't mentioned: perspective taking, empathy, self-reflection, critical thinking, for sure dialogue, storytelling they're doing, openness, authenticity, that's what we're moving. And so they're not just helping them learn, but these are workplace skills they have to have. And so I'm intentionally, not only the content, but what they're learning and practicing they can take back. At this point, we're at one of my favorite activities ever, and this will be one I'll be doing in the Virtual Institute in a couple of weeks. The card activity. I was at Simmons College in 2007, and I was like training orientation facilitators. And I was teaching about Let Me In, which is in the lesson plan that I mentioned earlier. And a student said, have you ever seen the card activity? I'm like, no. And so they told me about it, and I've used it in probably 95% of the workshops ever since. I don't know who created it or if what they told me was the original work or if it had been so many of these things over the last probably 40, 50 years. Things have been tried, passed down, creatively done. But when I know where I got an idea, I try to acknowledge it. So everybody gets a playing card, and it doesn't matter if they look at it because people will. And I ask them to be ready to move and to hold the card facing down and to go trade it 5 times. And that's for people who are looked at it. And then when they're done trading, they're holding it down so nobody can see it. And then you hold it up facing others. And then I say, go interact with at least 20 people, and I'll show how to interact, which could be, hey, how you doing? Did you have a good weekend? How was that game? Or how's work going, right? So I'll show how to talk to people. Or it could be like, and if you just notice, I kind of did head nod. I'll also model you just go, so you don't have to talk to people, but you must interact. And then I'll say, at least 20 people in the room, and then notice what's going on around you, but never tell anybody what card they have, and never try to look at your card. So go do that for a couple minutes. I'm playing because I actually love this activity, and I'm kind of hamming it up. And then afterwards, we stop, and the questions are, what card do you think you have and why? And at this point, I'm trying to get people that haven't talked yet. Now, I'm not staring at them, but 8 to 10 people, and I want to make sure I've got high cards, middle cards, and low cards talking. So earlier I would say ace to jack are the high cards, 10 to 7 are the middle cards, 6 to 2 the low cards. And all this is written up in that lesson plan. I'll ask, how did you know? How were you treated? Get a few more stories. Now, if it's a large group and you don't have mics, you can have them turn to 2 or 3 people and answer these, but I love doing it in a large group. It's just my style. And then eventually, what happened in this activity that feels familiar with organizational dynamics? And I'll hear a few of those out. If it's a small group and they're not working well in small groups, so like it's 20 people, and when they get in small groups, they're not working well, but usually they work better in small groups. I'll stay large group, but usually I'll put them into small groups, 2s or 3s. Now, and I might say, look at your card and then tell people how you got treated. That'll kind of ease off the energy. And then, what are some groups that get treated like low cards? How do they get treated and the probable impact, and tell a quick story. And I'll get 1 or 2 of those in the large group so that I know the concepts are in the room of privileged, marginalized, but we're not using the language quite yet. And then what are groups that get seen as middle and high cards? And I'll get people, and I actually do this with my hands. I learned this from Chris Henderson with LC White Cross, and I just do it unconsciously. And I'll have them talk in small groups. At that point, again, if time is short, I might say, so, because you want to pull the concept. So how did you decide who was a high card? So let's brainstorm. Who are the high cards in this organization? And they'll do it by level, hierarchy, age, years of experience. Push them. You have to push them probably to race, gender, sexuality, gender identity. But they'll do it. And I'll often have the list up, right? So they have to look up, or I'll say, look through your group identity cards and talk about. And then I'll say, what are the characteristics that had you decide who the high card was, and who the low card was, and who the middle cards? You can do that. Another way you can debrief it. I was trying to pull out the concepts, but this is another way. If I'm working with an intact team, I might have them talk about this. So even though they have done the marginalized mattering activity earlier, it's like I still might want them to share it as a group, and so that they have the capacity. So I might want to even treat it like a high card, medium card, low card. If it's leaders or executive teams or other diversity change agents, I might have them say, how do you generally get treated? What's one card? And I'll model, I usually get treated like a queen or a king when I'm in an organization training. And then give different examples when you're treated better or worse, and when you're treated like a 10 sometimes, based on group identity, when you're treated higher, maybe like a 3. That's a great conversation. You can be doing this with, again, diversity councils, inclusion practitioners, but this level of team building can be powerful. Executive teams, it's also very powerful. What we're trying to do now is get people the concepts of privilege marginalized. And so, again, they can pull them out. Who are the privileged groups and how did you decide was the privileged group, marginalized group? The left hand, right hand, who's left-handed? Is the world set up for left-handed, right-handers? And get 8 to 10 examples. People laugh, it just shifts the energy. You can do that. I'm loving Dr. Beverly Tatum's moving walkway from Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Her second edition revised is just out. I think it's a 20-year edition or 25-year edition. And have people brainstorm, how is a moving walkway just like privilege? So that's fun. You can also, with an image like this, ask this question. Put people into small groups at different stations with charts. One's a privileged group, one's marginalized, and one's middle, right? And say, what are the common characteristics, the degree of access, experiences, treatment, feelings, behaviors, assumptions about them, and let them chart for a while and then move to the next station, read and chart, move to the next station. If you have 20 people, you can do 3 of those. If you've got 40, just do 2 sets of stations. Some people might want, and then how do you relate to this? That can be in small groups. Some people are great lecturers, and so they could lecture this, but I like people to get it themselves. There's also this handout, which is on page 54, these same concepts. So sometimes I put people individually, think about a privileged or marginalized identity of yours. And when do you relate to this seems true? And when do you relate that seems true? And then talk to somebody or a small group. So there are different ways to get privileged and marginalized concepts into them, not just the group, privileged, marginalized groups, but the daily dynamics that happen in the card activity. What does this look like? Other people don't do this. It depends what you want, but I just wanted you to see this, if that concept would be important for your organization. I want to make one quick question, a privilege walk. That's another way to talk about privilege. I don't do that activity anymore. Enough people with multiple marginalized identities, or even one, talked about the emotional labor and impact on them. It really is designed for people in privileged groups, especially multiple, to see privilege. And so I do it different ways, and you see how I'm doing it, and it seems useful. At this point, folks are needing a little shift of energy, so I'll have clap once you see the horse's head. Most people see the frog, as you probably do as you're listening to this, and you kind of have to turn your head or turn the slide to actually see the horse's head. And then I'll ask, how is this like privilege and marginalization? And it's like, sometimes we need help seeing privilege, and sometimes we also don't recognize marginalization. By the way, I use this, depending on the workshop, I could use this in 5 or 6 different places, but it fits here nicely. And I like to use these kind of mind activities to re-energize, shift the energy, and to make a point. I find that learning, when it's paired with a story, a graphic, an image, an experiential activity like the card activity, really goes deep. At this point, folks are ready for much more learning, but I think I'm gonna just highlight this and maybe start part 2, go into a little more depth, but have them look at their own privileged identities. There are several different activities. It'll be page 55, 56 has a different variation where they have to, we've been talking about other people, but this gets them to do their own. And then there's some reflection activities they can do, but again, I'll start part 2 with this. You can also use group identity cards doing it, make 3 different lines of cards. But I've learned that they have to have the sheet to pay attention. I'm only doing this now with folks that show me so far they've already got a lot of good foundation. Because I find when I do this with people new to it, they get lost. So I use the chart. But if I'm doing the group identity cards, I'll show my 3 groups that I use, and then really let them talk. Feelings, reactions, how they intersect, therefore how people engage you. how implicit bias of others impact how they engage you, given what they assume or see about you, and then therefore how do you engage others, knowing that's what they probably are doing. So you can tell these questions, again, I do about half of all that I'm sharing with you in a one day, but I wanted you to get a bunch of variety. And if it's a work group that really needs to get this deep because they're change agents, then I would do some of this. And then the last one I'll share today is I have them then make 2 stacks of cards. What's on your screen and what's not. What's really you think about when you're doing this work, and which ones like, I didn't thought about that. And I'll model. I usually have race, gender identity, sex assigned at birth, sexuality, class. Those 5 are often. Immigration status, not all the time. Not all the time disability status. Veteran status, hardly. And so I have to work to keep them all. And so they make now 2, turn to somebody. By now, it's not about you're bad, you're wrong. It's just how we need to move forward. What you'll see in part 2 is at this point, I then move into implicit bias, microaggressions, interrupting them, and then moving to the systems level. So that's where we'll go in part 2. Take a deep breath. On the front of your packet are links, not only get free copies, complimentary copies of my 3 books, PDFs, you can download them, but also resource materials. And to be honest, the Turn the Tide book, that book I would require reading for anybody that's facilitating, because it's all about navigating difficult situations externally and navigating yourself. And there are many activities that you can then do if you're doing a train the trainer to have people do work around that. And whether you identify as white or other privileged identities, but I'm not racist, could be useful to learn more about privilege and really unpack your own privilege and thinking about it. Again, I'll do the Virtual Institute, June 21st. We got part 2 coming up, July 12th, and then the Virtual Institute, the 31st. August, it's similar activities, but I'm going to package them, again, far fewer, but how do you create an inclusive team? And I'll add a few other pieces too, inclusive classrooms if you're teachers or faculty. And then we'll start navigating difficult situations in September. Would love to see you July 9th, because I think we're going to have a lot of the questions you've been typing in there. And again, if you have other topics as we move into next year about virtual institutes. Again, if you want to work with me more long-term, I'll be starting a new master class for inclusion practitioners on August 3rd. I'm finishing up the last 4 sessions now. If you want to join now, you'll not only get these last 4 sessions, but I'll let you stay the entire next 12. And I think by the end of so if you're at this point, I don't know, be October or whatever, you'll be able to watch me facilitate and coach. And so you can learn the content. And then I think those extra ones, you can really help do that. And then if you want to work long-term with me, my year of transformation is just fun. That's an amazing way for people to quickly become change agents and deepen their capacity internally, externally. And I still have a few slots because some folks have moved off because they've moved on after the year. And I'm going to go to the questions. And Catherine, if there were a couple, because we have just a couple minutes. And I thought, what if we just do a couple questions?
Yes. Okay. So one of the questions that came in was, how do you do this work when working with 100% remote teams?
You can probably see my face. So I'm going to pull from my master class for inclusion practitioners, and I've taught navigating difficult situations, self-care virtually. So I still do live. So you may want to pop onto some of my virtual institutes to see how I do it. 100% remote teams, I'd have them on a Zoom. Now, if there's 100 people, I would do them in small groups. So you literally can see everybody. You can give homework so they can do some of the activities beforehand. And then it's like a flipped classroom. That's jargon in higher ed, meaning they do the activities beforehand and you come together to debrief and talk about it. You could have a message board or whatever they're called, where you're like, all right, think about a time you mattered and everybody write it in. And so it could be a chat room like this, and everybody writes in. It does take longer, but then you say, now just take a moment and read 3 or 4. And now, what feelings did you have as you felt you mattered? So you could do it using the chat room a lot. That's the best I can do. It's not my strength. I don't believe in electronic e-courses in diversity and equity, but it's only because I haven't seen a good one, in my opinion. I believe in engagement and face-to-face. That can be virtual, but that's my best thinking. And homework in between. The other thing is I'd hook them up so they have a high five buddy and they're accountable for doing activities. So whatever we do in the course, let's say we do mattering, marginalized, and we do card activity. So each of those they get and they talk about and they debrief with one other person. Now it can be the same person of the entire, it would probably be 8 to 12 sessions to try to even do the content that I did just today. And then you can switch that, or you can have them in small groups. In the masterclass, I have people teach others. So I mean, like if I was doing this, I'd say, go have this conversation with 2 other people. Go lead the card activity with somebody. That might be of a stretch because they're still learning. So I'll back off on that. That's my best thinking. What else, other questions do you have, Catherine?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to that from a technical standpoint, just if that was part of the question, is if everybody was remote, these virtual webinar platforms like what you're using right now, Kathy, has the options for breakout rooms. So you could assign people a partner, break them out, and they could have private conversations, and then you bring them back together 10 minutes later.
I love it. So this Zoom right now, I could do that?
Yeah, we would have to set it up a little differently for you today, because this one, we did one where they're not actually in an interactive space, but you can set up Zoom so that they have interactive spaces and they can have these breakout conversations. Yes.
I love it. Maybe I'll try that and learn how to do it so they can talk to each other.
Correct. And nobody else would hear. You would partner people and then break them out, and then you could bring them back, and then you could send them back out together. You set people up in pairs. Yes.
And while I love Zoom, there might be other platforms like this. And then if you're an organization that's larger, 100 to 200, they might have the software and access.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cisco has some great products that are a little bit more expensive, but yes, still very, very possible.
Woohoo. Were there any more questions? I saw one.
There are, yes.
What else you got?
How can you do this work when you're limited to 2 hours for a workshop?
You may have just seen my head go down. So you say, that's a good start. So let's start with a 2-hour workshop. And then at the end, we'll see what else people would like to know. I'm going to save that for after we do part 2. I'll give you a quick answer, but after part 2, I'll be able to say, if I had 2 hours, I would do this, but I'll say it here. 2 hours, I would probably do matter and marginalization. I'd probably do card activity, and then I'd move into some microaggressions. I mean, if it's literally all you'll ever have, and then some tools you'll see next time, my pairs and some other stuff, tools to engage. It's a fast 2 hours, it's possible. But I would negotiate from the beginning, let's start here, and then say what's going to happen is folks will leave and they either won't learn anything or they'll be frustrated that their colleagues didn't learn anything. And so if that's all we can do right now, what if we do that? But then I ask, who wants to learn more? And not everybody, but we can get some volunteers to do a part 2 and a part 3. And again, you can always email me what that might look like, or we can get on a phone. But it's not quite inclusion practitioner model, but you can do next level. So you literally take all that I did today, break it into 3 sessions, and with some of the stuff from next time with microaggressions. We're a little over time, but there's still a lot of people here. What else you got?
Okay, the next one is Kathy. How do we get, this one, the beginning part's worded a little interesting. How do we get out of a time when we can't answer the audience's question? If someone straight up asks, what about reverse racism when I'm a white male and I feel attacked?
Yeah, the Q&A would be a great place to do a lot of these what ifs. My quick thought would be, and again, difficult dialogue. So that's going to be a whole nother set of skill competencies. I want to have the person know that they're not alone without validating that I agree with them. So I might say, every once in a while I have someone ask that question. And what I know is, as a white person, I still sometimes have prejudice come at me. Prejudice, anybody can have prejudice at the individual level. it took me a while to realize that when we talk about racism, it's policies and practices. Now, notice I went into teaching, which may not be the strategy, but I'm working the whole group. I'm not necessarily working that person, and say, what I know is, actually, I might say, can you tell me a story? Now, this is real fluid because you don't know what's going to happen. I'm like, well, tell me a story about reverse racism. And they might say, you know, I went into a store and it was mostly folks of color working, and I got really bad customer service. I was like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. I hate customer service. It's not really good. Has it ever happened to you any other time? Because I know sometimes I get really bad customer service and people that are white too. And it just sucks, doesn't it? So this could be a great question that I'll come back to in the Q&A. And again, we're recording those, so I'll come back to that. And then I'll see if there are folks of color that might be on that also want to engage, because my answers might be very different coming white to white as opposed to white impacted by a person of color. In general, I would say whatever, for anybody, whatever your triggers are, because that one is so tough if you're in the marginalized identity by race. That before you do workshops, you're working with folk about what are our triggers individually, collectively, and then think, well, what could we do? And if you're pair presenting, and that would what I would do, particularly across race. And so if you happen to be up as a person of color and there's a comment like there's reverse racism, the white person, you can look at the white person. Now, I wouldn't have the white person jump in without them first negotiating, because it might be you as a person of color want to answer it. But also you may want to look over and say, well, that's my thought. What do you think, Julie? And say, well, so it could be a tag team as well. And folks that say that, there's probably nothing you say in the moment that will be about education. So I usually work the group at that moment, and I do not usually go into a lot. As you saw me, I was kind of pivoting and acknowledging, and also I'll say, you know, I'm glad to talk to you after. I had similar thoughts. So glad to talk to you after about what the organization's about and our role as leaders. We're about creating an environment where everybody feels supported and valued, and that includes folks that are white. And often that's where we start. What we have to also realize is every folk of color pretty much in this organization is feeling marginalized. And that's what this workshop is about, is to help us understand what we don't yet see and we don't yet understand. I don't know. Sometimes I extrovert, it's good. Sometimes it's not. So hope that might have been somewhat helpful. We still have a bunch of people. What if we take one more, and then I'll just honor that you all have lives besides my webinars.
There's actually only one more left, so I think that's perfect.
Perfect.
All right. What would you recommend doing when leadership is completely silent and uninvolved in regards to diversity and inclusivity? On my college campus, there's a lot of opportunities to engage in these conversations, but leadership from my specific division are never there and have done nothing. Silence and inaction from leadership. How do you deal with that?
So if you haven't seen the last two webinars on creating inclusive organizations, because there are just some systemic dynamics that are going on, those might be useful to you. To be honest, I'd see if you can get an inclusion practitioner or a train the trainer program going, so that you're getting many more people that have the internal capacity to be in work units, raising issues, interrupting microaggressions, training each other. And then leaders will just have more people around them raising issues. You can also direct it head on and say, let's look at our data. If you haven't done a survey lately, sometimes data collect up a whole bunch of, part 2, we'll do an activity that I learned at UMass Amherst called Gallery. I do it differently, but you collect up real stories, generic, anonymously, and use those. And so if you can collect up 50 to 60, 70 stories from students, staff, and faculty or people that are related that they serve. You might be in advancement, and so you're looking at alumni and donors. So think about who are your constituents, who are you there to serve, who do those leaders care about, and get stories from those folks. And because you said you're higher ed for sure, a bunch of students, but also staff that show microaggressions and the impact. And you'll understand this more after part 2. Collect those up and then see if you have one almost ally in the leadership team who would be willing to bring those stories to a leadership team. So they're not in front of anybody else, so they can save face, but they have an internal conversation where they literally read aloud these stories and then talk about what's the impact, what if this is just the tip of the iceberg. So those qualitative stories, real-time, current, plus the stats. And it could be your organization is just like, yeah, no. And so what can you do in the middle and lower quote ranks to keep building capacity, to get people speaking up? And so if you've got folks who are willing to do trainings, lunch and learns, or willing to do it in the evenings, Saturdays, you start with the willing folks that'll be there. And then in your sphere of influence, just start deepening capacity. And then some people start noticing, they'll go like, how that person has changed. And then it can be a very long process. And again, if you want to hop on the phone for looking at strategies to change management strategies at the top, you all have my information, I think, on the beginning of the handout. You can email me, or now that you're on my list, we'll probably be sending out, Catherine, I'm sure we'll send out this recording to everybody. Plus, if you want to schedule a time to talk with me. What happens is when I start sharing resources like this, we get the what ifs, and I love those dilemmas, and that just takes a lot longer, and it's, but I'm glad to have the conversation. So feel free to bring it to the Q&A and/or we can hop on the phone. Well, thank you all, and thanks for staying. These questions were fun. We still have about half the folk. I hope you found some of these tools useful as you try them out. If you want to email me with the other questions, feel free. And I really look forward to looking at part 2. And the registration for that, Catherine just put that in, and you'll be getting emails from me for sure, as well as Facebook, if you're on my Facebook. And you may want to bring even more people to the next one. I'm going to ask people that come to part 2 to really watch part 1, and so they can just watch part 1 and then come along. All right, take a deep breath. Thank you for all the work you're doing to create greater inclusion, and particularly for engaging the resistance and the dilemmas and the people that are just not on board. So this foundational workshop can get more and more people. And as you see the rest of it, I think you'll be able to sit back and go, okay, I see the design and the scaffolding. So with that, I'll see you next month for part 2, and I hope to see you on the Q&A or the Virtual Institute. With that, have a lovely June. All right, take good care. Bye-bye.